Let's do this. Okay, good morning. This is David Liggett, and this is our HawkPodcast episode number 2. So we made it through our first one, and thank you for everyone who's actually, we just shared it yesterday and this morning. So, but it is now online. So if you're interested, we just passed along our first podcast or put it out there, and we covered 8 ways the industry has changed since I started. So hopefully that is beneficial to you in whatever you do in the data center industry. And wherever you're listening from today, thank you for jumping in. We're excited to continue this. And, you know, if you didn't join us for the first one, our goal with our podcast is really to talk about things in the data center industry that are pushing the market and changing it. So we're highlighting different trends. We're highlighting different components of the market that are really making it different. And this is a dynamic market. It's a super young market. So it's, you know, the first publicly traded company was back in 2004. There's just a lot of additional growth that we believe is going to take place over the next several years. So those are the type of things that we're going to talk about, you know, on our podcast. I think on the next one, the next couple, we'll actually cover some individual data center markets, and I'll be able to highlight why data center users are, you know, looking for data center infrastructure in areas like Northern Virginia, Chicago, Dallas, Phoenix, Silicon Valley, just all throughout the United States. And then also we'll talk through some of Canada's growing markets as well. So anyway, we're really excited you're here and you've jumped in to listen. Today, we are talking about 5 reasons companies lease data center infrastructure. And the reason I wanted to cover this today and on our podcast was because, you know, this is really what has transformed the data center multi-tenant market over the last 5 years. And it has changed significantly, and just the mindset of the user has totally changed as the market has matured over the last 10 years. And so I actually think that these reasons are just as applicable today as they were 3 years ago. In fact, maybe even more, given the growth that we've seen. You know, in 2017, Uptime Institute released some survey results that they had done. And the main finding of these results was that 65% of enterprise workloads, enterprise IT workloads, were still in on-premises data centers owned by the companies themselves. And so one thing that if you're in this business, we talk about how really transcendent cloud infrastructure adoption has been. I think it's easy to forget that there's still companies that do have a significant portion of their IT workloads in, you know, data center infrastructure that they own today. And so there is still a growth that will take place and a transition that will happen for these companies as they look at, as they work through hardware refreshes, as they work through different compliance issues, and they end up having to evaluate different options. I really think there is a whole other wave of opportunities for the leasing of, you know, if you think about just colocation infrastructure, but also cloud infrastructure as well. So today we're talking about 5 reasons companies lease data centers. And again, I think if you're a data center user, what I would say is, you know, these are really good components to evaluate your strategy and put your strategy up against these reasons and see if these reasons resonate with you and your team. You know, if you're a data center operator, I think these reasons show how the market has matured and how, you know, the data center provider has changed to meet the needs of users. You know, if you're a data center investor, we talk to a lot of data center investors that are trying to understand, you know, what has this market been and how will this market grow moving forward? You know, this is why you have seen literally over the last 3 years, I was looking at our data center Hawk Insight tool. We've literally seen over 1,000 megawatts of commissioned power, leased power in the top 10 U.S. data center markets over the last 3 years take place. And that growth had never happened before in the data center industry the way that it has, over the last several years. And so, if you're an investor listening, you can hear how companies are choosing to take their IT workloads and actually lease the infrastructure instead of doing it themselves. And so anyway, it's a fascinating topic to cover. So here's 5 reasons companies are leasing data center infrastructure today. The first one is simple. There's an economic advantage to it. And I think that kind of comes with the thought process behind, hey, I can either, invest all the money up front and own this infrastructure, which is, traditionally more about control and more about a permanent decision, or I can pay less up front and, have some flexible options down the road. And there's some economic advantages to doing that. As companies think about their strategic options as it relates to their infrastructure, it's really important to evaluate multiple options. No one wants to go to their company and ask for $200 million to go make a data center infrastructure decision and then get asked, hey, did we evaluate multiple options? And the answer is no. That's just not a good strategic position to take to your company as it relates to your infrastructure. So, traditionally, the control, owning it yourself, building it yourself, is about 2 things, and one is it's a permanent solution traditionally, and then 2, it's a costly solution. It just costs more money. By outsourcing, companies are not obligated to pay the upfront money needed to bring that solution to life. And so, the companies that we've seen, at least in the last 5 years, obviously can spend that money on their rent and have additional financial flexibility with the capital saved on the front end of the process. And this is just, when I got into the space, I would say, 10, 11 years ago, this is dramatically different than it was then, just the leasing versus owning. There was banks were building $200-300 million data centers, and, insurance companies were doing that. And they had decent reasons for doing it. But I think what we've seen in the last several years is a lot of those companies have actually sold their data center facilities for a lot less than they invested in the facilities when they first, spent the money to build them. So, it's just a smaller upfront investment if you're going to lease data center infrastructure, and then repositioning the upfront cash required to build the data center through leasing. It's a credible economic advantage for the right size company. So, small company, medium-sized company, large company, it's an economic advantage on the front end. There's a value of the economies of scale that data center operators have today. The data center user really benefits from that. And here's what I mean. Users are directly benefiting from, these large data center operators, Equinix, Digital Realty, CoreSite, QTS, all these big CyrusOne, these big data center companies that are leveraging their position by creating cost advantages relating to facilities, power costs, and operations. And when you leverage those positions, you're able to take advantage of some cost savings related to that. And that's one of the things we've seen, the cost per megawatt. When data center investors track this market, the provider world knows as well. But when you look at the cost per megawatt of construction over the last 5 years, it's amazing to see how much it's gone down. And there is some, apples to apples comparison that has to be done. Data center provider A might look at their cost per megawatt of construction differently than data center operator B, and that's an important thing to note. But the reality is, and the trend is that it has gone down. Data center operators have figured out how to build data center infrastructure faster and more efficient over the last several years, and you can see that by the growth that's been taking place. And so this is a direct benefit to the data center end user as well. Another economic advantage is just to the power costs that data center operators will negotiate with power companies. Most operators own multiple locations in multiple markets, and so they will leverage their position regionally to ensure the lowest power costs can be attained. And that's a big savings as the power requirement grows, just more and more savings to the end user. So it's one of the reasons that the data center user is leasing infrastructure today is the economic advantage it creates. And if you are a data center user, I would just say this: truly understand the cost. If you are a data center user that is utilizing colocation, you really need to understand how a rental rate impacts your 10-year commitment to a data center operator, how power cost impacts that, how PUE impacts that whole cost overview. If you're utilizing cloud, I think, understanding how cloud, the cost behind the solution impacts you today, but also what that looks like in the future, especially as you grow. If you are able to scale up, which is one of the big advantages of cloud, really thinking through, hey, if we do scale up, does this get more costlier over time? And is there pain if we have to take this infrastructure and somehow migrate it to something different? So just understanding the cost, so important. But it is true that companies will lease data centers because there's an economic advantage. And the one thing I'll end with on this point is, one question that we'll get often is, why don't all companies lease data centers? Because it doesn't happen, and it's not always the right solution. There are companies that have to own and operate data center infrastructure themselves. Some of them with a large enough critical load can justify the spend to own their own data centers. Typically these are companies with 5 to 7.5 megawatt requirements or higher, really big IT infrastructure requirements. They can do that. And this is actually what we saw, years ago with some of the big cloud providers today that are actually leasing infrastructure. But we definitely saw that. Some companies aren't able to lease infrastructure because they can't leverage the lease option because of regulations tied to their industry. Healthcare and government data center users can struggle with compliance issues, and that can cause a barrier to acceptance, despite the fact that both the colocation and cloud industry is growing in their compliance adherence. And then I think that the third part of that, why all companies don't lease data centers, is because bad experiences with past operators, situations will take companies down the ownership route. And if a company has an outage that is, that impacts them that day, but also for, with the missed business that they had while they were down, that can be a big challenge. So again, the first reason that companies lease data center infrastructure is because of the economic advantage that it creates. And that's an advantage, we believe that will always be there just because of the capital it takes to actually build, own, and control your own data center solution. One of the things that I talked about in our last podcast at a high level was how flexibility has become more and more valuable to the data center user over time. And that is the second reason that data center users today are leasing infrastructure, is the flexibility that it provides. And it does that in a number of different ways. Flexibility is valuable to the end user because of the changing environment. And with technology, with business, with infrastructure, there's changes always taking place. So the greater the flexibility, the bigger the advantage to the end user. And that's something that I think the data center operators have actually done a really good job of understanding, is how can we create flexible solutions to really meet the needs of the user. Instead of trying to force the user into something we think you should have, let's figure out how to adapt our product to meet the needs, the real needs of the users today. And that's one of the things that we've seen for sure. And this is a control versus flexibility. You give up initial control to have flexibility down the road. And so there's some things data center users have decided they can live with, but with that comes flexibility. There's a couple different types. One type is just the geographic flexibility that you get when you lease data center infrastructure. And leasing provides an advantage to that. So, if you're leasing colocation or cloud resources through third-party operators, you can strategically place actually geographic locations in multiple markets. And, the alternative to that is building data center infrastructure in those markets, which is a long-term high capital commitment that only proves financially viable and practical for a small amount of companies. Most companies don't have that scale and need to justify that type of capital commitment. But the fact that the data center operator community today provides multiple locations, sometimes in multiple markets, to meet the needs of users, is highly valuable, and it's an advantage. The other thing that we've seen related to flexibility is tied to the contracts that have taken place. So data center operators might not like me communicating this, but the reality is when I started in the market back in 2007, 2008, you're really seeing some of the transactions that were out there being done for 7 to 10 years. And I think what companies have pushed for is, hey, we need more flexibility. We don't know where our business is going to be in 5 years, let alone 7 to 10. So we need a more flexible contract. We need to be able to shift our operational load from this to this, or this market to this one. And so I think that the flexibility, some of the changes in the way that people buy today, cloud operations can be charged by credit card and by the day. So it's an elastic solution for companies that need short-term solutions for smaller periods of time. And I think that whole world is starting to make its way to the colocation market for sure. And so just the lease flexibility that the data center users today have is an advantage when leasing. And then the other thing that I think is absolutely huge, it has grown the business over the last several years, is the service flexibility that data center users can have with the change, never knowing what you're going to need. The interconnection, managed services, cloud connectivity, all those different things can be offered now through lease infrastructure solutions. So just the ability to serve the business as the needs change over time, leasing that infrastructure really provides that. And so if you think just access to cloud, managed services, dense network options, these are services data center operators are investing in today by creating ecosystems for their users to take advantage over time. And you see that especially in companies like Equinix, CoreSite. You even see some of the larger data center operators that traditionally have just been wholesale type providers that are working to change their solution and their ecosystem to meet those needs as well. So the service flexibility has made a big difference for data center users in the way they can grow with the data center operator. And that's really why data center users have decided that leasing infrastructure makes sense, because it's become more flexible over time. One of the other things, and this trend is really seen especially on larger transactions. So the third reason that companies lease data center infrastructure is the scalability that it provides. Because no one knows how the market will grow, being able to grow and scale up as things change is just really important. And creating an effective IT strategy for the end user is really challenging. And because most of their needs are changing, the strategy's got to evolve. And changes to the company's core business, acquisitions, consolidation projects are a number of examples why predicting the IT infrastructure needs is really hard. And so, while one solution fits the business today, it might not tomorrow, and it might require an alternative approach several years from now. So I think as companies are facing the burden of dealing with these changes, they're wise to consider the impact that these changes have to their IT infrastructure that's designed to support their current needs. And I think you see a lot of this with some of the product features that are added to technologies today. You for sure see this in the social networking world, in the way different features can create spikes in user demand. I think a good example is how Instagram has used Instagram stories. That was really something that Snapchat started back in 2013, but that feature was added to different to Instagram, and so that's added a whole new spike of user demand for that team, and so you've got to adjust the IT infrastructure to that, scale up to meet that need, and so it's highly valuable for data center users to be able to do this. And I think you have seen, if you think about one of the biggest changes to the data center industry over the last several years is big, large companies leasing massive amounts of infrastructure. So not owning it and not going to Iowa, or nothing against Iowa. I love Iowa. But going to, secondary markets and buying land and building, owning, and operating the infrastructure itself. But really and truly, taking that infrastructure and leasing it. And scaling up, so leasing 5 megawatts now, but growing to 10 or 15 down the road, and not having to commit that day one is highly valuable. So, by the way, a story about Iowa very quickly. One of the greatest business trips with a client that I ever went on was a site selection kind of trip through the Midwest, and we went to Omaha, Des Moines, Tulsa, and Dallas, looking at data center infrastructure sites. So we ran a pretty big search. This is literally like 8 to 9 years ago. Ran a pretty big search, went into each market. And so when we got to Omaha, we decided that each night of the week that we would have, everybody had to eat steaks, every meal, every dinner. And at the end, we would determine what city had the best steaks. So Omaha, very proud of their, if you're from Omaha, great restaurant. I remember the steak I had. I can't remember the restaurant. Des Moines, same thing. Tulsa, surprisingly enough, good steak there. In Dallas, I'm gonna let you guess. Where do you think? Have I told you this before? No. Where do you think had the best? What city do you think had the best steak? Yeah.
I feel like stereotypically it ought to be Dallas, but I don't know. I haven't been to any of the other places.
Well, we ate steak every night, and the winner was Dallas. Yeah, surprising. But anyway, there you go. So if you're in those markets, and I'm not dissing the steak in those other markets, but Dallas had the best one that trip. But, I think as companies have kind of migrated away from those larger, those secondary markets and are pushing towards bigger markets, they're trying to lease, but with the ability to scale. So that is a huge advantage to the data center user. And so, if you think just with the scalable option, companies are able to handle the unknowns quicker, more efficiently. Both colocation and cloud for sure provide users with a scalable solution designed to fit needs over time. And so, with colocation, companies can plan a phased approach when they're with their infrastructure, allows them to ease into their solution over a period of time. And then cloud, I think, provides even greater scalability, allowing a company to lease infrastructure in smaller units of memory and time. So cloud also provides an easier way to scale down when IT load isn't as heavy. And you see that in the retail industry and other industry verticals that have heavier seasons as it relates to their data center market use. But scalability for sure is an advantage to leasing data center options. It's one of the reasons that we've seen the data center market grow the way that we have. So I mentioned earlier, over the last 3 years at Data Center Hawk, we've tracked the top 10 markets: Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, LA, New York, Northern New Jersey, Northern California, Northern Virginia, Phoenix, and Seattle. And in those 10 markets over the last 3 years, we've added over 1,000 megawatts of commission power. And one of the reasons that's happened is because of the fourth reason companies lease data center infrastructure, and it's because it's a competitive market. This is one of the key reasons that the market has grown the way it has, is because the data center provider maturity. And so if you want to actually listen to in our first podcast, it kind of hit that and really talk about how the data center market or data center provider has matured. But this is a key component to the growth that we've seen, and the reason that companies are leasing infrastructure today. Over the past several years, data center users are looking to partner with data center operators that are offering the services they need now and in the future. And I think if you're a data center user, I'm just going to do a little quick tangent here. If you're looking to partner with a data center provider, you really have to think about today and tomorrow. Meeting your needs today is highly valuable, but you've got to look towards the future and assume that your needs will change, and make your best assumptions around what you think those needs are going to be, and then ask the question, can this data center operator, can I grow with them moving forward? And that is it's a big question, because traditionally when you enter into any type of contract, co-location, cloud, whatever it might be, it's challenging to get out of, because you depend on that infrastructure. A lot of times it's unclear as to what will happen if you remove that infrastructure. So just making sure that you know how they can impact, how you can grow with them over time related to your needs is really important. And I think that's what the data center provider world has realized is their services have broadened to meet the needs of the end user today. I think many of the acquisitions that we've seen over the last year, in 2017, we saw over $20 billion of data center industry acquisition take place. A lot of that had to do with different services that they provided to different clients, and companies really looking to grow fast in those markets. But if you think about disaster recovery, cloud, managed services, colocation, interconnection, and other options, those are all things that are available from a services perspective today from the data center world. And it's just really created a very competitive market. Another thing that you see today is just the efficiency in facilities that are being constructed. And it's a different facility today than it was, however long ago. But I think just the ability for data center operators to deliver greater efficiency in construction and the way these facilities are operated is a direct benefit to the end user, and it makes it just highly competitive. I think data center operators are building their buildings faster, cheaper, more efficient than ever before. And, the data center operators' operational procedures have improved over time, and these companies are now focused on constructing facilities with greater uptime, critical systems, redundancy in certain cases, security, compliance, connectivity, ecosystems, all designed to stay ahead of the competition and reach a large group of customers. And so you take that efficiency and you place it in Northern Virginia, Chicago, Dallas, Phoenix, Northern New Jersey, Silicon Valley, Seattle, all those markets, you're seeing the competitive market really attract data center users to that. And with that has just come more aggressive economics. So, the market maturity and competition in the data center market has really driven pricing lower for users today. If you compare that to 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the rates are significantly more aggressive. And it also allows users interested in renewing contracts to the ability to achieve a fair market rate transaction. These rates are tied to infrastructure and services that are negotiable, but they provide the users the opportunity to partner with the most well-suited provider. So the extreme competition in the data center market is one of the reasons companies today are leasing data center infrastructure, and the competition is only getting better. And it's one of the reasons, frankly, that we don't see a lot of data center operators, new entrants to the market. If you're thinking about a data center user, they don't want to be the first customer for a data center operator, and so experience is highly valued as it relates to the relationship between data center user and a data center operator. So one of the questions that will get asked is, well, how does if a new data center operator comes in, how do they get their first customer? Well, traditionally the individuals that are leading these companies have come from other companies. They have relationships. They're proven in the market. They've done, they've run publicly traded companies. They have spent many years working on data center infrastructure and understand customer needs. So that's traditionally how it happens, but it does take a while because experience, capital, your ability to deliver what you say you are is something that obviously takes time to complete. But if you just think about the data center industry and why companies are leasing today, one reason, and it will continue to be, is just the competition in the market. And then the fifth reason that companies are leasing data center infrastructure today that we're seeing is the time savings that takes place. Never before has time been as important as it is, especially as it's related to, business opportunity, business growth, and your ability to support business needs. And so, if you think about cloud and colocation, entering into a relationship with a data center operator, there's, a number of benefits. But speed to market is now a more influential part of how companies evaluated needed data center solutions. And I think that will grow in importance. It's one of the reasons that, if you think about the larger, if you're in the data center business and you track the space, and you think about the large transactions that have occurred in the last 12 months, a lot of them are tied to, a lot of the drivers behind that is speed to market. Can this infrastructure be ready in time to meet the demand that we have coming? It's one of the reasons, if you're in the commercial real estate business tracking the data center industry, you're seeing these sale leasebacks take place. Data center organizations that built the data center based on a projected demand load, and then they deliver the data center infrastructure a year and a half later, and they recognize that they either over-provision what they need. Hey, let's build a 5 megawatt data center, and they just needed 500 kW. Or let's spend $50 to $100 million in this, and we only need to spend 20. So those are the type of decisions that have led to the sale leasebacks taking place. It's the easiest way, most of the time, for a data center operator to grow into a market, is to find, a data center that was purchased and buy the existing business. The tenant does a small lease back, and then the data center operator can lease that moving forward. And we've seen that lately in markets like Dallas, Kansas City, Phoenix, some in Northern Virginia, some in Atlanta, some in Chicago. So, that is definitely a trend that you're seeing moving forward. And I think, leasing often provides an organization with a faster path to their data center solution. The infrastructure is already in place. Companies can move into their lease solution immediately and implement their strategy. It has, and cloud is even faster. Organizations can add additional services and scale up the amount of capacity needed of having to design, build, and install their own data center. So this is just the way the market has turned. But I think that you're seeing, even as cloud providers are leasing their data center solutions instead of building their own, is a good example of how timing can influence these decisions. In the past, these are the cloud operators who we talked about before that have built and owned data centers in markets with low power costs and favorable tax incentives. And over the past, 12 to 24 months, we have seen that change. And that is why, as an example, Northern Virginia in 2Q 2018 did 157 megawatts of commissioned absorption from a power standpoint that took place. So that's, one of the big reasons today companies are leasing their infrastructure is the time savings that it allows them to gain. And so, again, just if you think about the 5 areas and reasons why companies are leasing data center infrastructure today, they make a lot of sense. I mean, one is the economic advantage. I mean, it is a true cost savings to be able to lease infrastructure and not have to buy it up front and spend the capital on the front end to do that. There's a flexibility that is offered by data center providers today if you lease data center infrastructure, or cloud providers if you lease infrastructure from them. The third reason is just the scalability and the ability to grow over time and not have to commit to so much on the front end is a huge advantage. The market is extremely competitive, and it will only get more competitive, especially if you think about, I'm talking like U.S. wise, but especially as you think about the international growth, what's taking place over there, the ability for data center operators to want to serve customers internationally. We've definitely seen that become a more important part of the discussion. So just the competitive market side is a huge reason that companies are leasing infrastructure. And then the fifth reason is the time savings, the ability for a company to save time because the infrastructure is already there is really important. And so those are the reasons today that companies are leasing infrastructure. I think that there's a good chance in 3 years from now we could review this list and have very similar feelings to those reasons why those things are still taking place. I think one of the changes could be as it relates to where the data center demand will come from, the actual geographic locations and strategically where data center users will want to place their infrastructure. But it's certainly an interesting component. And this is the part of the market that has changed the most over the last 5 years. It has really grown the data center industry. For all of our investors that are listening, the leasing of this infrastructure, the data center operator's ability to appeal to the end user and not just the IT group at those organizations, but the CTO, the CIO, the CFO, and have those conversations. Well, that's why you've seen the multi-tenant industry grow, data center industry grow the way that it has. That is what we wanted to cover today. 5 reasons companies lease data center infrastructure. Hope you're enjoying the podcast. Again, jump on our podcast site. You can actually see this on YouTube as well. So we're everywhere, I feel like. I mean, it seems like that. But we're on YouTube. You can find us on Spotify, iTunes, SoundCloud, as it relates to our podcast. But then also, too, if you have any questions, let us know. So one of the things that we're going to add to this podcast is listening to questions that are being asked and being able to answer them with the research that we have. with the industry expertise that we have. So if you do have questions about the space, if you do have questions about topics we've covered, if you have questions about data center markets, let us know, because we will answer them on our podcast. So wherever you are in the listening universe, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one. That's all I got. Done.